If someone chooses a rule over basic human judgment during an emergency, you find out very quickly what kind of leader they really are. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and I never imagined that an ordinary Wednesday morning would become the day my entire neighborhood started questioning the person they had trusted to represent them. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops when I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and noticed water rushing across the sidewalk in front of my house. At first I thought a sprinkler had malfunctioned, but within seconds I realized this was much more serious. A steady stream was pouring from the ground near the edge of the community green space, spreading across several driveways and slowly moving toward the street. I immediately set my coffee down, grabbed my phone, and called the utility company's emergency number to report what I was seeing. While I waited for the operator, I walked carefully toward the source, making sure no one accidentally stepped into the growing puddle. The representative thanked me, confirmed that a crew had been dispatched, and advised me to keep people away from the affected area until professionals arrived. That seemed simple enough. I returned to the sidewalk and began politely asking neighbors taking their morning walks to use the opposite side of the street. Everyone appreciated the warning, and within a few minutes several residents were helping direct joggers and dog walkers around the area. Nobody panicked. People simply cooperated because it was obvious that keeping everyone safe mattered more than anything else. Then I heard the sound of a vehicle slowing behind me. A white sport utility vehicle stopped along the curb, and Diane Foster stepped out carrying a clipboard under one arm. As president of the Homeowners Association, she always seemed to know exactly what was happening throughout the neighborhood, but her attention was not focused on the water spreading across the pavement. Instead, she looked directly at the temporary orange safety cones that one of my neighbors had placed near the sidewalk after finding them in his garage. "Who authorized those?" she asked in a firm voice. I explained that the utility company was already on its way and that we were simply trying to keep pedestrians away from the area until the crew arrived. Diane folded her arms. Community property cannot be blocked without board approval. For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. I glanced at the widening stream of water before looking back at her. The emergency dispatcher asked us to keep people clear until the workers get here. I replied calmly. These cones are only temporary. Diane shook her head. Neighborhood appearance standards still apply. I took a slow breath and reminded myself that arguing would solve nothing. The crew should be here soon. We are only trying to help. Instead of responding to that, she wrote something on her clipboard while looking around at the gathering neighbors. Mrs. Collins from 3 houses down quietly whispered, "This probably is not the most important issue right now." Diane heard the comment, but continued writing without looking up. Another resident arrived carrying a small folding caution sign from his workshop and asked where he should place it. Before I could answer, Diane instructed him not to put anything else on association property without permission. The neighbor hesitated, clearly unsure whether to listen to the HOA president or the emergency instructions that had already been given. I stepped forward and thanked him for offering to help, suggesting he simply wait until the utility crew arrived. The tension in the air had nothing to do with raised voices because nobody was shouting. It came from something much stranger. Every passing minute made it more obvious that one person was focused on preventing a potential hazard while another seemed determined to enforce procedures first. More neighbors stopped to watch, not because they enjoyed conflict, but because they could not believe the conversation happening in front of them while water continued flowing steadily across the neighborhood sidewalk. The next 10 minutes felt much longer than they actually were, because every passing minute brought another neighbor outside to see why water continued flowing across the sidewalk. The stream had become wide enough that people naturally slowed down before crossing the street, and several parents walking children to school appreciated the temporary cones because they clearly marked the safest path around the affected area. I stayed near the edge of the sidewalk, reminding everyone that the utility company had already been notified and that professional crews were on the way. Most people thanked me and continued on their way without complaint. Diane Foster, however, remained focused on the orange cones and folding caution sign. She walked over to one of the cones, examined it for a moment, and then turned toward me with the same composed expression she always carried during neighborhood meetings. "These items are creating an unauthorized obstruction on association property," she said. "Please remove them immediately." I looked at the widening stream before answering. The dispatcher specifically asked that we keep people away from this section until the crew arrives. Diane responded without hesitation. The association has procedures for temporary installations. Residents cannot simply place objects wherever they choose. Mrs. Collins quietly shook her head. There is water everywhere. They are only trying to help. Diane thanked her for the comment, but continued writing notes on her clipboard. Across the street, another homeowner, Mark Ellis, walked over carrying several unopened bottles of water from his garage refrigerator. He offered one to everyone standing nearby, trying to lighten the mood while people waited for the utility workers. Hopefully they get here soon, he said. Nobody wants this getting any worse. I agreed, and together we looked toward the entrance of the neighborhood for any sign of the service truck. Instead of discussing the situation with Mark or asking whether anyone had spoken with the utility company, Diane asked me another question. Did you receive permission from the board before coordinating this response? I honestly did not know how to answer because the question seemed disconnected from everything happening around us. I called the emergency number because water was running across the sidewalk, I replied. That was the first priority. She made another note without saying anything else. By now, nearly a dozen neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance. Nobody was arguing. Everyone simply watched the unusual conversation unfold. Several residents quietly exchanged confused looks because the difference in priorities had become impossible to ignore. Just then my phone rang. It was the utility dispatcher calling with an update. She explained that the crew had been delayed by another service call, but was only a few minutes away. She thanked me again for helping keep the area clear and asked whether the water flow had increased. I answered her questions, confirmed that neighbors were staying safely away from the affected section, and ended the call. Diane immediately asked who had been on the phone. The utility company, I answered. They said the crew is almost here. Rather than acknowledging the update, she calmly replied, until they arrive, I expect association guidelines to be followed. Before I could respond, a delivery van approached the neighborhood entrance and slowed as the driver noticed the cones directing traffic around the wet pavement. The driver carefully followed the marked path without difficulty and continued toward the next street. Mark looked at the rest of us and quietly said, "Looks like the cones are doing exactly what they were meant to do." Nobody disagreed. The conversation paused for only a moment before another unexpected development changed everything. A pickup truck with the utility company logo finally turned into the subdivision, and several neighbors let out relieved smiles, believing the difficult part of the morning was finally over. None of us realized that the arrival of the repair crew would only bring even more questions about everything that had happened before they reached the neighborhood. The utility truck rolled slowly to the edge of the flooded section, and two technicians stepped out carrying inspection equipment. One of them walked directly toward the flowing water while the other thanked everyone for keeping pedestrians away from the area. Hearing those words immediately caught the attention of several neighbors standing nearby. I pointed toward the temporary cones and explained that residents had placed them there after the emergency dispatcher recommended creating a safe path around the affected sidewalk. The technician nodded with appreciation. That was the right decision, he said. Until we know exactly what is happening underground, it is better to keep people clear. Before anyone else could respond, Diane Foster stepped forward and introduced herself as the president of the Homeowners Association. She politely explained that the temporary markers had been placed without board approval and expressed concern about unauthorized items being positioned on community property. The technician listened respectfully before answering in a calm voice. Right now our priority is making the area safe while we inspect the line. He then asked whether anyone had reported when the leak first appeared. I raised my hand and explained that I had called as soon as I noticed the water crossing the sidewalk. The technician thanked me again and began examining the ground with specialized tools. Within a few minutes, another member of the crew joined him, and together they identified the approximate location of the underground problem. They requested a little more space while they completed their inspection, so everyone naturally stepped back. Diane remained nearby, occasionally writing notes on her clipboard, while neighbors quietly observed the work. The atmosphere had changed because people were no longer focused only on the unusual conversation. Now everyone wanted to understand what had actually caused the emergency. After several minutes, the lead technician returned and explained that a damaged underground water line appeared to be responsible for the steady flow. Repair equipment was already being requested, but until additional workers arrived, the safety markers needed to remain exactly where they were. Mrs. Collins looked toward Diane before quietly saying, "I suppose that answers the question about the cones." Nobody laughed or reacted dramatically. The comment simply reflected what everyone had just heard from the professionals. Diane acknowledged the technician's recommendation but reminded everyone that temporary measures should always be documented for association records. The technician smiled politely and replied, "We appreciate organized communities, but during situations like this, immediate safety comes first." His response was respectful, yet several neighbors exchanged thoughtful looks after hearing it. As the repair crew continued preparing the site, more residents walked over carrying bottled water, folding chairs, and umbrellas for neighbors waiting in the morning sun. The gathering no longer felt tense. It felt like a community coming together around an unexpected situation. Mark Ellis offered to help direct delivery vehicles around the work area until the repair truck arrived, and another neighbor volunteered to notify anyone approaching from the opposite entrance. Everything happened naturally without arguments or confusion. Standing there, I realized how quickly ordinary people could organize themselves when the goal was simply helping one another. Just as the technicians began marking the pavement for repairs, Daniel Foster walked over holding his phone. He quietly told me that his doorbell camera had likely recorded the entire morning from the moment the water first appeared until the utility crew arrived. "I was checking something else," he said, "and I realized the camera captured almost everything from across the street." I looked at him with surprise. If the recording really covered the entire sequence, it would show exactly when the leak began, when the emergency call was made, when neighbors placed the cones, and every conversation that followed. Without realizing it, an ordinary neighborhood security camera might have preserved the complete timeline before anyone had even thought about documenting what was happening. Later that afternoon, after the repair crew had successfully stopped the water flow and reopened the sidewalk, Daniel Foster invited me over to review the footage from his doorbell camera. We sat at his dining room table with a laptop between us while the video loaded. The recording began before sunrise with an empty, quiet street. A few minutes later, a thin stream of water became visible near the community green space. Less than 2 minutes after that, the camera showed me walking outside with my coffee, stopping suddenly, looking toward the sidewalk, and immediately reaching for my phone. The timestamp matched the call history on my phone exactly. We continued watching as I spoke with the emergency dispatcher, then carefully guided a few early morning walkers around the growing puddle. Everything happened calmly and exactly as I remembered. A few minutes later, Mark Ellis appeared carrying the orange safety cones from his garage, and together we placed them where pedestrians could clearly see them. No one blocked traffic. No one created confusion. The cones simply marked a safe path around the wet pavement. Daniel paused the recording and quietly said, "This timeline answers a lot of questions." We continued playing the video. Diane Foster arrived several minutes after the cones had already been placed and after the emergency call had already been completed. The recording captured our entire conversation from across the street. Although the camera did not record every word clearly, it showed the sequence without interruption. It showed the technicians arriving later, thanking the neighbors for keeping people away from the area, and leaving the cones exactly where they were while they completed their inspection. There were no missing moments and no confusing edits. It was simply a continuous record of the morning. Daniel exported a copy of the footage and saved another backup in case it was ever needed. He also suggested writing down the exact timestamps while everything was still fresh in our minds. That evening, Mrs. Collins stopped by after hearing Daniel had reviewed the recording. She was relieved to learn that someone had preserved the entire sequence because, as she explained, different neighbors had already started remembering small details differently. "Now nobody has to rely on memory alone," she said. Her comment stayed with me because she was absolutely right. Memories change over time, but a simple recording captured events exactly as they happened. The following morning, several neighbors greeted me while I collected my mail. The conversations felt noticeably different from the day before. Instead of asking what had happened, people were asking whether the repair had been completed and whether the utility company had explained the cause of the leak. The focus had shifted away from rumors and toward facts. Around lunchtime, I received an electronic mail from the property management office requesting a brief written summary of the events surrounding the emergency. The message explained that the association was collecting information for its records after the utility repair. I replied politely with a detailed timeline, including the time I noticed the water, the emergency call, the arrival of the technicians, and the steps neighbors had taken to help keep the area safe. I also mentioned that a continuous doorbell camera recording documented the sequence from beginning to end. I made no accusations and offered no opinions. I simply listed the events in chronological order. Less than an hour later, I received a short reply, thanking me for the information and confirming that the association would review all available documentation. As I closed my laptop, I realized the conversation had quietly changed direction once again. For the first time since the emergency began, the discussion was no longer centered on opinions or assumptions. It was beginning to revolve around a complete timeline supported by records, timestamps, and a camera that had quietly observed everything without taking anyone's side. Over the next several days, the neighborhood slowly returned to its normal routine, but conversations about the emergency continued wherever neighbors happened to meet. People were no longer debating what they thought had happened because the timeline was becoming clearer with every new piece of information. Instead, they were asking why such a simple effort to keep people away from a temporary hazard had become the center of so much disagreement. One afternoon, Mrs. Collins invited several neighbors to sit together outside after dinner, and the discussion naturally turned back to the events from earlier in the week. Mark Ellis mentioned that he had found the original receipt for the orange safety cones in his garage while cleaning up after the repair. He laughed and said he had purchased them years earlier for a home improvement project and had simply grabbed the closest safety markers when he saw water spreading across the sidewalk. Everyone agreed that the decision had been made in a matter of seconds without anyone expecting it to become controversial. Daniel Foster then opened his laptop and quietly replayed a short portion of the doorbell camera recording for the small group. Nobody interrupted while it played. The timestamps clearly showed the emergency call happening before the cones were placed, followed by neighbors calmly directing pedestrians around the wet pavement. Several minutes later, the recording showed Diane Foster arriving after those actions had already taken place. The sequence matched the written notes I had submitted to the property management office exactly. Mrs. Collins looked around the table and said something that stayed with all of us. "This video does not tell anyone what to think," she said. "It simply shows what happened." That observation changed the tone of the conversation. Rather than criticizing anyone personally, the neighbors began discussing how emergencies should be handled in the future. One resident suggested creating a simple community contact list for urgent situations. Another proposed keeping temporary safety supplies in the clubhouse storage room so residents would know exactly where to find them. The discussion became practical instead of emotional. The following morning, I received another electronic mail from the property management office thanking me for the timeline I had submitted. The message also asked whether I would be willing to provide the timestamps from Daniel's recording if they became necessary during the association's review. I immediately replied that the information was available and that Daniel had agreed to preserve the original recording exactly as it had been captured. A short time later, Daniel received a similar request, asking only whether the video had been edited in any way. He answered that it was the original unaltered recording directly from his doorbell camera system. Later that afternoon, I was trimming the grass near my driveway when Diane walked past during her usual neighborhood inspection. She slowed for a moment, glanced toward the repaired section of sidewalk, and then continued walking without saying anything. It was the first time since the emergency that we had been within a few feet of each other without exchanging even a single word. Across the street, several neighbors noticed the quiet moment, but nobody attempted to interrupt. By then, it seemed as though everyone understood that the important questions would no longer be answered through conversations on the sidewalk. They would be answered by the complete timeline, the written records, and the review that was quietly taking place behind the scenes. As the sun began to set that evening, I realized something had shifted throughout the neighborhood. The focus was no longer on defending individual decisions. It had become a shared effort to understand whether the community's response during an unexpected emergency had truly reflected the priorities that everyone believed their neighborhood should stand for. 3 days later, every homeowner received an electronic mail announcing a special community meeting to review the neighborhood's response during the recent utility emergency. The notice explained that representatives from the property management company, members of the HOA board, and the utility provider had all been invited so the timeline could be discussed openly. That announcement immediately caught everyone's attention because meetings like this were rare. On the evening of the meeting, the clubhouse filled much earlier than usual. Nearly every chair was occupied, and people who normally exchanged only quick greetings in passing were now quietly comparing notes about the morning of the water leak. The atmosphere remained respectful, but there was an unmistakable sense that everyone wanted clear answers instead of assumptions. The property manager opened the meeting by thanking residents for remaining calm throughout the emergency and for cooperating with the repair crew. He then explained that the purpose of the meeting was not to assign blame, but to review what had happened and determine whether community procedures could be improved. After introducing the utility supervisor who had overseen the repair, he invited him to summarize the response. The supervisor described the sequence of events beginning with the emergency call received shortly after sunrise. He confirmed that the caller had accurately reported the location of the problem and that the dispatcher had advised keeping pedestrians away from the affected area until technicians arrived. He also explained that temporary visual markers were helpful because they reduced unnecessary foot traffic near the damaged section while the crew completed its inspection. Hearing that confirmation from someone completely outside the neighborhood immediately focused everyone's attention. The property manager then asked whether any documentation existed showing the sequence before the crew arrived. I quietly raised my hand and explained that Daniel Foster's doorbell camera had recorded the entire timeline. Daniel stood, confirmed that the recording remained in its original form, and provided the exact timestamps. Rather than projecting the video immediately, the property manager first summarized the written timeline submitted by several residents. Every account described the same basic sequence. Water appeared first. The emergency call followed. Neighbors placed temporary cones. Diane Foster arrived afterward. The technicians later requested that the markers remain in place until repairs were completed. When the manager finished reading the summaries, he asked whether anyone present remembered the events differently. The room stayed silent for several long seconds. Finally, Diane stood and calmly explained that her concern that morning had been maintaining community procedures while information was still limited. She acknowledged that her focus had been on association guidelines because she believed consistency was important, especially during unexpected situations. No one interrupted her. After she finished speaking, the utility supervisor respectfully added one observation. He explained that during active service calls, immediate public safety always became the first priority until the condition was stabilized. Community rules remained important, he said, but temporary precautions that protected residents were generally encouraged while trained crews were on their way. His statement was delivered without criticism or emotion, yet it carried significant weight because it came from the person responsible for managing the response. Around the room, several homeowners quietly nodded. Mrs. Collins thanked the supervisor for explaining the process in such clear language, and Mark Ellis remarked that hearing the reasoning directly from the professionals answered many of the questions residents had been discussing for days. As I looked around the clubhouse, I realized something important had changed. The conversation was no longer centered on personalities or disagreements between neighbors. Independent information from the property manager, the utility supervisor, written timelines, and preserved recordings had begun replacing speculation with facts, and for the first time since the emergency, it seemed that everyone in the room was finally working toward the same understanding of what had actually happened that morning. When the meeting resumed after a short break, the property manager explained that one final set of documents had been collected before any recommendations would be discussed. He placed a folder on the table and carefully arranged several printed pages in chronological order so everyone could follow the sequence. The first page contained the time the emergency call had been received by the utility company. The second showed when the repair crew had been dispatched. The third summarized the arrival time recorded by the technicians once they entered the neighborhood. Every timestamp matched the information already provided by the doorbell camera and by the residents who had submitted written accounts. There were no unexplained gaps in the timeline. The property manager then produced a copy of the association's emergency response guidance that had been included in older board training materials. He explained that while the document was rarely referenced during routine meetings, it specifically encouraged board members to cooperate with emergency responders and prioritize temporary public safety measures until the responsible professionals arrived. Several homeowners quietly leaned forward to read the highlighted section projected onto the screen at the front of the room. The language was straightforward and easy to understand. Temporary precautions intended to reduce immediate risk were to be supported whenever practical during an active incident. A quiet murmur spread across the room as people compared that guidance with what they had witnessed during the water leak. Diane Foster reviewed the document for several moments before speaking. She acknowledged that she had concentrated on neighborhood standards because she believed she was protecting association property, but she also admitted that she had not reviewed the emergency guidance before approaching the situation that morning. Her voice remained calm, and for the first time she sounded more reflective than defensive. The utility supervisor thanked her for saying so and explained that unusual situations often required quick judgment based on changing conditions. He emphasized that cooperation between residents, community leaders, and service crews usually produced the safest outcome. Daniel Foster then offered to provide the original recording directly to the property management office so it could be preserved with the meeting records if necessary. The manager accepted the offer and thanked him for maintaining the original file without making changes. Mrs. Collins smiled gently and remarked that one ordinary security camera had probably answered more questions than weeks of speculation ever could. A few neighbors quietly laughed, not because anyone had been embarrassed, but because the statement captured exactly how everyone felt. Facts had gradually replaced assumptions. Mark Ellis also spoke briefly, explaining that if another emergency ever occurred, he hoped residents would never hesitate to help one another while waiting for trained crews to arrive. Several homeowners nodded immediately in agreement. The discussion no longer centered on who had been right or wrong. Instead, it focused on how the community could respond better the next time something unexpected happened. Before closing the meeting, the property manager summarized everything that had been confirmed. The emergency had been reported promptly. Temporary markers had been placed after the call to the utility company. The repair crew had appreciated those precautions and requested that they remain in place during the inspection. The available documents, recordings, and professional statements all supported the same sequence. Looking around the room, I realized that the atmosphere had completely changed from the uncertainty of only a few days earlier. Neighbors who had once whispered questions in their driveways were now openly discussing practical improvements for the future. More importantly, the conversation had shifted away from opinions entirely. The complete timeline, supported by independent records and patient cooperation, had quietly become the strongest voice in the room, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the community was preparing to make decisions based on that evidence rather than on assumptions. As the meeting entered its final discussion, the property manager placed one last recommendation before the board and the homeowners. He explained that after reviewing the utility records, the written statements from residents, the preserved camera recording, and the association's own emergency guidance, the sequence of events was now well established. No evidence suggested that the temporary safety measures had created additional problems. On the contrary, every independent source pointed to the same conclusion. The cones and caution sign had helped direct pedestrians away from the affected area until trained technicians could assess the damaged water line. The manager paused for a moment before continuing. He recommended that the board formally recognize that the residents who acted that morning had done so in good faith while responding to an unexpected situation. He also suggested that the association update its procedures so future emergencies would clearly place temporary public safety ahead of routine administrative concerns until professional responders declared the area secure. A quiet round of approving nods spread through the room before anyone even spoke. Diane Foster remained seated for several seconds, looking over the printed recommendations in front of her. When she finally stood, the room became completely silent. She explained that she had accepted the findings presented during the review and acknowledged that her attention had remained too narrowly focused on association procedures during the first moments of the emergency. She said that although her intention had been to protect community property and maintain consistency, she now understood that the circumstances had required a different approach. She thanked the utility supervisor for explaining the response process and thanked the residents who had helped maintain a calm environment while waiting for the repair crew. Her words were measured and sincere, and no one interrupted. The atmosphere in the clubhouse changed immediately. There was no celebration and no confrontation. Instead, there was a noticeable sense of relief that everyone was finally working from the same understanding of the facts. The board members then voted on the manager's recommendations. One by one, each member supported updating the emergency response procedures and documenting the lessons learned from the incident. The motion passed without disagreement. Mrs. Collins quietly smiled and whispered that the entire neighborhood would probably benefit from those changes for many years. Mark Ellis added that having clear guidance would help residents feel more confident about assisting responsibly if another unexpected situation ever arose. Daniel Foster received a brief thank you from the property manager for preserving the original recording, which had helped verify the timeline without relying on conflicting memories. I appreciated the recognition, but more than anything I appreciated how the discussion had evolved. Weeks earlier it had felt as though every conversation revolved around opinions. Now the community had reached its conclusion by patiently reviewing evidence, listening to independent professionals, and allowing every piece of information to fit together naturally. As the meeting came to an end, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand before leaving the clubhouse. They did not congratulate me for winning anything, because nobody viewed the evening that way. Instead, they thanked me for remaining calm throughout the process and for continuing to document events instead of reacting emotionally. Walking toward the parking lot, I glanced back at the clubhouse lights and realized that the most important change had not been the updated procedures or the official recommendations. The real change was that the neighborhood had seen the complete picture for itself. Once the timeline was fully understood, assumptions quietly disappeared, confidence returned, and the conversation shifted away from personalities toward a shared commitment to making better decisions whenever the community faced another unexpected challenge. Several weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood gradually settled back into the familiar rhythm that had existed before the broken water line changed everything. The repaired section of sidewalk looked no different from the rest of the street, and anyone driving through for the first time would never guess that dozens of neighbors had once gathered there watching an unexpected emergency unfold. Yet for those of us who had experienced that morning together, the community felt noticeably different in the best possible way. At the next monthly association meeting, the updated emergency response guidelines were officially distributed to every homeowner. The new document explained in clear language that during unexpected situations involving utility crews or other responding professionals, temporary safety measures intended to protect residents should be supported until the appropriate authorities declared the area safe. It also encouraged better communication between board members, property management, and homeowners whenever unusual circumstances required quick decisions. The changes were straightforward, practical, and easy for everyone to understand. As residents read through the updated guidance, many quietly commented that the neighborhood would be better prepared if another emergency ever occurred. Diane Foster remained involved with the association, but her approach during meetings became noticeably different. Instead of speaking first, she often invited residents to share their observations before discussing board procedures. She listened more carefully, asked more questions, and frequently reminded everyone that understanding the complete situation was just as important as following written policies. The change did not happen overnight, but over time neighbors noticed the difference. Conversations became more collaborative, and disagreements that once might have grown into larger conflicts were often resolved through calm discussion before they had the chance to escalate. Daniel Foster continued saving recordings from his doorbell camera, joking that he hoped the only exciting thing it would capture from then on would be delivery trucks arriving before dinner. Mrs. Collins organized a neighborhood appreciation picnic later that summer, and families who had stood together beside the flooded sidewalk now laughed together beneath the shade of the community park. Mark Ellis brought the same orange safety cones, placing them beside the picnic entrance as a playful reminder that even ordinary objects could become part of an unforgettable story. Everyone smiled because they understood the reference. Looking around at children playing, neighbors sharing homemade food, and people talking comfortably across front lawns, I realized that the strongest communities are not built by pretending problems never happen. They are built by facing unexpected situations with patience, honesty, and a willingness to learn from them together. When I think back to that morning now, I do not remember the flowing water as clearly as I remember the choices people made afterward. I remember neighbors offering help without expecting recognition. I remember professionals calmly explaining facts instead of fueling arguments. I remember careful documentation replacing rumors and assumptions. Most of all, I remember discovering that respectful persistence often accomplishes far more than frustration ever could. If I had learned anything from the entire experience, it was that leadership is measured less by how someone applies authority during ordinary days and more by how they respond when circumstances suddenly become unpredictable. Rules matter because they help communities function, but good judgment, open communication, and genuine concern for the people those rules are meant to serve matter just as much. In the end, no one truly benefited from conflict itself. The real victory belonged to a neighborhood that chose transparency over speculation, cooperation over division, and practical solutions over unnecessary confrontation. Every time I walk past that stretch of sidewalk now, I see nothing unusual at all, and that ordinary view reminds me that sometimes the most meaningful changes are the ones that quietly remain long after the emergency has been forgotten.